It is 8 o'clock in the morning. August 31st, 1985. East Los Angeles. A man is running. Not jogging. Not late for work. Not chasing a bus. Running for his life. He has just crossed 6 lanes of the Santa Ana freeway on foot. Dodging cars at highway speed, jumping a barrier, landing on the hood of a vehicle on the other side and rolling off it. And he is still running. Still moving. Still not stopping. Moments earlier, he had walked into a convenience store in this neighborhood. Just an ordinary shop. Newspapers on the rack. Refrigerators humming at the back. A group of elderly women standing near the door. And one of those women had looked up from whatever she was doing, and she had gone very still. She pointed at him, and she whispered 3 words that he had never heard directed at himself in public before. El Matador. The killer. He looked down. And there, on the front page of the newspaper La Opinion, sitting right there on the rack in front of him, was his own face, staring back at him. Headline in Spanish: Invasor Nocturno. Night Invader. The police press conference announcement printed below it. We know who you are now, and soon everyone else will. There will be no place you can hide. He grabbed the newspaper without paying for it and ran. For over 14 months, this man had moved through California in the dark. He had walked into homes while families were sleeping, while children were in their beds, while husbands lay next to their wives, while elderly women lived alone in apartments they had every right to feel safe in. He had killed at least 15 people. He had attacked dozens more. He had left an entire state afraid to open its own windows at night. Gun sales across California surged. Hardware stores ran out of deadbolts. Neighborhood watch groups formed on streets that had never needed them. People who had slept with their windows open their entire lives stopped doing it. For over a year, the police had no face. They had no name. They had shoe prints, fingerprints that had nowhere to go, and the descriptions of survivors who all agreed on one thing: that the man who had come through their windows in the dark had a look about him that did not sit easily in a human face. And now he was running down a residential street in East Los Angeles, with his picture on every front page in California, with nowhere left to go. But here is what most people do not know about what happened next. The man who stopped him was not a detective. He was not SWAT. He was not part of any task force. He was a 57-year-old man named Jose Burgoyne, who had been standing in his front yard on Hubbard Street, watering his plants, when he heard his neighbor calling for help. And there is something else. Something that the police buried in a file for 25 years. Something that only came to light through a DNA laboratory and a cold case detective who had never forgotten a 9-year-old girl. A second person was at the very first crime scene. Their DNA was found in 2016. They have never been identified. That case is technically still open today. And there is a woman, his own niece, who published a book just weeks ago, in April of 2026, that tells a story about Richard Ramirez that the world was not allowed to hear while he was alive. A story that begins when she was between 6 and 7 years old. But before we get to any of that, before we get to the capture, before we get to the DNA, before we get to the book that his niece finally had the courage to publish, you need to understand what this man had done. What he had been doing in the dark for over a year. What kind of damage a single person can leave across 2 cities before anyone knows his name. Because the story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, is not just a true crime story. It is the story of a child who was shown what murder looked like before he was old enough to understand what seeing it would cost him. A city that had no language for what was moving through its streets at night. 2 detectives who built a case from almost nothing, while their own mayor accidentally destroyed one of their best clues on live television. A fingerprint that sat in a filing cabinet for over a year, waiting for technology that had not yet been invented. And a neighborhood in East Los Angeles that did what the police could not do, and stopped him with their bare hands on a residential street on a Saturday morning. Welcome to Truth Finder Afees, and welcome to today's case of the day. If this is your first time here, this is the channel where we go deep on the cases that deserve more than a headline. We do not skim the surface. We do not skip the difficult details. We find the truth, all of it, and we lay it out for you completely. Before we go any further, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. Because everything you just heard, the niece, the unsolved second suspect, the man with the garden hose, the mayor who accidentally helped a serial killer escape. None of that is in this chapter. All of that comes later, and you are going to want to be here when it does. You will only see it if you are subscribed. And drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you are watching from right now. I read every single one. Now, let us get into it. To understand what Richard Ramirez became, you have to go back before he was even born. You have to go back to a boot factory on the outskirts of El Paso, Texas, where a woman named Mercedes Munoz spent her days standing over industrial machinery, breathing in chemical fumes, with no mask, no ventilation, and no warning from her employer that what she was inhaling could reach the child growing inside her. In those years, factory workers were not encouraged to protect themselves from what surrounded them. They breathed and they worked and they went home. Mercedes was a kind woman, a devout Catholic, a mother who worked because her family needed her to. She had already given birth to 4 children before Richard, brothers Reuben, Joseph, and Robert, and a sister named Ruth, and every one of them had been born with some kind of physical defect, ranging from respiratory difficulty to bone deformities. The fumes had done their quiet work long before Richard arrived. On February 29, 1960, Mercedes gave birth to her 5th and final child. A boy, the youngest. They named him Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez. The family called him Richard, sometimes Ricky. He was born on a leap year date, a day that only comes around once every 4 years. He had arrived slightly out of step with the ordinary calendar of the world, in a way that would turn out to be one of the most accurate things anyone could have said about him. The Ramirez household was not a soft place. Julian Ramirez, Richard's father, had come from Ciudad Juárez, Mexico, where he had worked as a policeman before emigrating to the United States. In America, he found work as a laborer on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. He had also sustained a serious head injury in a workplace accident at some point before Richard was born. He drank. He had a temper that filled every corner of whatever room he stood in. And when that temper needed somewhere to go, it went into the walls of that house, and into the bodies of his wife and his children. The 5 Ramirez children grew up learning the sound of their father's footsteps, learning to read the weight of a closing door, learning which kind of silence in the house meant safety and which kind meant you needed to make yourself very small very quickly. Richard's sister Ruth later said that her youngest brother never slept like a normal child. He was always up, always moving, always listening for something in the dark. Even as a toddler, before he was old enough to have a reason for it, he was already restless in a way that did not belong to ordinary children. His mother Mercedes tried. She prayed. She lit candles. She kept her faith in a house that seemed designed to extinguish it. But she could not place herself between Julian's anger and her children on every occasion. Nobody could have. Before Richard Ramirez ever encountered violence from the outside world, his own body had already been damaged by the world immediately around him. When he was 2 years old, he loved to dance. His family remembered that specifically about him, that even as a baby he responded to music. He would pull himself up and move to whatever sound was in the room. One afternoon he reached up for a radio sitting on top of a dresser, and the dresser came down on top of him. The impact split his forehead open and required 30 stitches to close. He was 2 years old. At the age of 5, he was knocked unconscious by a swing at a local park in El Paso. When he came around, something in the wiring had shifted. He began suffering epileptic seizures, grand mal seizures, the kind that take your whole body without warning and without mercy. The family had no money for proper neurological care. The seizures were managed the way poor families in 1960s Texas managed the unmanageable, with prayer, with fear, and with a helpless acceptance that some children were simply this way. What nobody around him understood at the time, what the psychiatrists and neurologists who examined him years later in prison would eventually conclude, was that those 2 injuries had done something specific and measurable to Richard Ramirez's brain. Something to the temporal lobe, the region that governs impulse control, the region that governs aggression and the capacity for empathy. In certain cases of early temporal lobe damage, combined with a chronic environment of violence and neglect, the consequences can be lifelong and irreversible. He was not broken by choice. The breaking had begun before he had the capacity to choose anything at all. And then, Into that already fractured architecture walked a man named Mike. Miguel Angel Valles, everyone called him Mike, was Richard's older cousin on his father's side. He had been born in Durango, Mexico, in June 1949 and came to El Paso as a teenager. He enlisted in the United States Army in 1970, went to Vietnam as a soldier who saw direct and severe combat, and returned to El Paso with medals. He came back with the kind of reputation that made a family proud. The returning veteran. The one the neighbors nodded at respectfully when he walked past. He also came back carrying something that nobody around him had the tools to identify or the language to describe. What we would now call severe post-traumatic stress disorder. What we would now call profound dissociation and psychosis. What the people around him saw in 1971 was simply, something was wrong with Mike since Vietnam. Something sat behind his eyes that was not quite right. But nobody knew what to do about it, so they left it alone. He was charming. He was funny. He was generous with his time. And he took a particular interest in his young cousin Richard, this quiet, strange, sickly boy who flinched at footsteps and was already sleeping in a cemetery to escape his father's rages. Richard was 12 years old when Mike began taking him under his wing. At first it was ordinary enough. They drove through El Paso together in Mike's truck. They smoked marijuana in the evenings, the veteran and the 12-year-old, watching the desert go orange in the setting sun. Mike told stories. Richard listened. Mike was the first adult in Richard's life who treated him as someone worth talking to, someone worth spending time with, the first one who did not seem to want to hurt him. And then Mike showed him the photographs. They were Polaroids, not war photographs in the way people imagine. Not images of combat or battlefield injury. They were photographs of Vietnamese women, bound, raped, murdered, mutilated, dismembered. In some frames, Mike was in the photograph himself, posing the way a man poses with something he is proud of. He laid them out and told Richard the stories behind each one. Not with shame, not with regret, with a chuckle and the casual pride of a man recounting a road trip. Richard Ramirez looked at those photographs, and looked again. His biographer Philip Carrillo, who spent over 100 hours with Ramirez at San Quentin, later described to A&E what happened in that truck on that hot El Paso afternoon. The wiring in Richard Ramirez that should have produced disgust produced something else entirely. At 12 or 13 years old, with 2 brain injuries, a violent home, and a father he was terrified of, violence and desire fused into a single thing inside him. Something that, from that afternoon forward, would never fully come apart again for the rest of his life. Mike also taught Richard practical things, military things, how to move through a building in darkness without making a sound, how to enter a space where someone is sleeping without waking them, how to read the layout of a room in almost no light. He passed these skills on the way a father might teach a son to fish, naturally, usefully, as tools for surviving in the world. He had no idea, or perhaps he did not care, what he was building. On May 4, 1975, Richard Ramirez was 15 years old. He was at his cousin Mike's home in El Paso that afternoon. Mike's wife Josefina, whom the family called Jessie, was there. There was an argument. The kind that builds and compresses until the air in a room feels like it is pressing in from every wall. At some point during that argument, Mike Valles reached for a handgun. He raised it, and he shot Josefina in the forehead. Richard Ramirez stood in that room and watched it happen. He was 15 years old. He watched a woman die 3 feet from where he stood. And according to every account he later gave in prison interviews, in the audio recordings released publicly in the 2024 Peacock documentary, it was not traumatic for him in the way that word normally carries meaning. It did not shatter him. It did not horrify him. It fascinated him. In the same way the photographs had. Mike told Richard to go home, to say nothing. Richard walked out of that house, walked back through the streets to his own home, sat down at the dinner table with his family and said nothing. He ate. He went to bed. Mike Valles was charged with Josefina's murder and found not guilty by reason of insanity, the court attributing the shooting to the post-traumatic stress disorder from his military service. He was committed to a psychiatric institution and released a few years later. He eventually remarried and continued living in El Paso. His health deteriorated steadily over the years from high blood pressure and substance abuse. On April 8, 1995, Miguel Angel Valles died of a heart attack in El Paso, Texas. He was 45 years old. He was buried with military honors, a 21-gun salute. He died a free man. And Richard Ramirez, who had stood in that kitchen at 15 and felt something other than horror, went back to his life. Quieter now, more withdrawn, more certain of something he had always half known but could no longer pretend was not true. Concordia Cemetery sits on the eastern edge of El Paso. A large old cemetery, Civil War graves, family plots going back generations, the graves of Chinese railroad workers from the 1880s. Quiet at night. The only sounds the wind through dry grass and the faint hum of the city beyond the fence line. Richard Ramirez spent much of his adolescence there. He began going to escape his father's rages. It was simply the one place in El Paso where Julian Ramirez could not find him. He would slip out of the house in the early hours, walk through dark streets, and find his way through a gap in the fence he had discovered as a boy. He slept among the headstones, in the grass, in the dark, with the dead for company. He later told his biographer that he preferred it there, that of all the places available to him as a child and teenager in El Paso, a cemetery at 3 in the morning was the one where he felt genuinely safe. Think about what that tells you. As he grew older, the Satanism that had started as a teenage flirtation, fed by heavy metal records, by AC/DC played on repeat in his room, by horror films and cheap occult paperbacks, deepened into something that felt, to him, like genuine belief. He found in Satan what he could not find in the Catholic God his mother prayed to. Something that asked nothing of him except power and appetite and the willingness to act on whatever was inside him. He also hunted in the desert outside El Paso at night with his father's .22 caliber rifle. Coyotes, rabbits, birds. When he caught something, he did not simply leave it. He disemboweled it, fed the entrails to the family dog. He later described those nights as some of the most peaceful of his childhood. During his mid-teens, Ramirez took a job at a local Holiday Inn in El Paso. The job gave him something extremely dangerous to give him, a master key, a key that opened every room in that building. He used it to steal from sleeping guests, moving through occupied rooms in the early hours of the morning without waking anyone, exactly as Mike had taught him. On at least one occasion he molested 2 children he encountered in an elevator. The incident was never reported. Then one night he escalated further. He attempted to rape a woman in her hotel room. Her husband caught him and beat him severely. Criminal charges were filed. But the couple lived out of state and declined to return to Texas to testify. The charges were dropped. Ramirez walked away without consequence. Pattern was forming. Violence. Escalation, arrest, release, a system that looked at this young man repeatedly and found nothing worth holding. Until California. Richard Ramirez dropped out of Jefferson High School in El Paso in the 9th grade in 1977 and was arrested that same year for marijuana possession. Charged, processed, released. Then he drifted through relatives' homes, stolen cars, whatever he could find, until the early 1980s, when he was around 22 years old and made the move that would define everything that followed. He came to Los Angeles, California. In the early 1980s, Los Angeles was a city of extraordinary contradiction. Sunlight and smog. The glamour of Hollywood pressed against the grinding squalor of Skid Row, sometimes on the same block. It was also, in ways the public would only understand later, a city that already had multiple serial killers operating within its boundaries at the same time, all unknown to one another, all unknown to the police. Ramirez arrived with almost nothing. Cheap single-room occupancy hotels in the downtown area. Walls thin enough to hear a neighbor breathe. He survived through burglaries. He was arrested for auto theft in 1981 and again in 1984. Both times he was processed and released. The system kept looking at him and finding nothing worth holding. His cocaine use worsened steadily. He moved from snorting it to injecting it. He ate almost nothing. His personal hygiene deteriorated until people who encountered him on buses or in shops moved away slightly, without knowing exactly why. His teeth were blackening. His eyes were wide and dark in a way that did not sit comfortably in a human face. He wore all black, every day, always. In his room at night he played one song, Night Prowler by AC/DC, from the album Highway to Hell. He played it for hours on end in the dark, the way some people pray, not out of habit but out of genuine need. A song about moving through darkness unseen and unheard. It matched something inside him with an accuracy that felt almost deliberate. He believed Satan was protecting him, that he had been chosen, that the darkness inside him was not a defect but a direction. He was 23 years old. He was invisible. He was accelerating. And Los Angeles had no idea he was there. Before we move into the crimes themselves, there is one more piece of this story that belongs here, in the origin in the El Paso years, because it is part of the same pattern. The same man. The same darkness operating behind closed doors before it ever became news. Rosie Juárez is Richard Ramirez's niece. His eldest niece. She grew up in El Paso inside the same family. In her memoir, published on April 10, 2026 by Redeemed Ink Press in El Paso, a book released just weeks before this video was made, Juárez detailed what her uncle had done to her. The abuse began when she was between 6 and 7 years old. Richard Ramirez had been living inside her family's home. And in the night, in the quiet, when the rest of the house was asleep, he came to her. It continued until she was 12 years old. She told no one at the time. She was a child. She did not have the language for it. The few times she tried to signal what was happening, including writing a letter to a friend that her mother intercepted, she was not believed. She told a social worker. The social worker did nothing. She carried it forward into her adult life the way survivors carry these things, invisibly at enormous private cost, in the lining of everything she wore. Juárez first spoke publicly about the abuse on the Tamron Hall show on March 10, 2021. It was former LAPD Detective Gil Carrillo, one of the two investigators who had spent years hunting Ramirez, who encouraged her to come forward and who appeared on that broadcast with her. It was Carrillo who told her that what she had to say mattered, that it was part of the truth of who Richard Ramirez actually was. Years before that television appearance, while Ramirez was still alive and on death row at San Quentin, Juárez had written him a letter confronting him directly. She named what he had done. She put it in writing and sent it to him. His reply came back in his handwriting. It said, "Yes, sweetie. I know you were pretending to be asleep. I don't know what to say." He did not deny it. He did not apologize. He acknowledged it the way a man acknowledges something mildly inconvenient, something that had happened, something that was in the past, something he had filed away alongside everything else he had ever done, and felt nothing particular about. Rosie Juárez today works as an educator within the Texas prison system. Her memoir, His Niece, published in April 2026, is not a true crime story. It is a survivor's account, and that distinction matters enormously to her. The man who would go on to terrorize an entire state was, before any murder, before any headline, before any name in a newspaper, already doing exactly what he would always do. Entering in darkness. Taking what he had no right to. Walking away without remorse. Now that you know who he was, where he came from, what shaped him, and what he chose to do with all of it, we can talk about what happened in California. We can talk about the night it began. By the spring of 1984, Richard Ramirez was 24 years old and moving between Los Angeles and San Francisco, between cheap rooms in both cities, sustaining himself through burglaries and cocaine and a growing sense of invincibility that felt, to him, like divine protection. In San Francisco, he was staying in a building in the Tenderloin district, one of the densest, most compressed neighborhoods in the city. Residential hotels, single-occupancy rooms, immigrant families making do with whatever the city offered. Ramirez had a room in one of those buildings on O'Farrell Street. He paid cash. He kept to himself. He was, to anyone who noticed him at all, just another drifter moving through. He had no idea that what he was about to do in the basement of that building would sit unsolved in a police file for 25 years. Her name was Leung. She was 9 years old. Chinese American. She lived in the same building where Ramirez was staying with her family in one of the residential rooms, the way many immigrant families in 1980s San Francisco lived, making a home in whatever space was available. On April 10, 1984, Leung was in the building with her 8-year-old brother. They were looking for a dollar bill the brother had lost somewhere. A $1 bill, the kind of small thing that matters enormously to a child. At some point during that search, Richard Ramirez approached Leung. He told her to follow him to the basement. He told her they would find the dollar there. She followed him. In that basement, Ramirez beat her. He strangled her. He raped her. He stabbed her to death with a switchblade. And he hung her partially clothed body from a pipe in the ceiling by her own blouse. Leung's brother returned to the basement approximately 30 minutes later. He found his sister hanging from a pipe. She was 9 years old. The San Francisco Police Department investigated. There were no strong suspects. A description was eventually put together. A white male, approximately 5 feet 10 inches, medium build, clean-shaven, brown hair, but it led nowhere. The case went cold. Leung became a name in a file. A 9-year-old girl who had gone into a basement and never come back out. While the man who put her there continued living and breathing and eventually became the most feared name in California. It was not until 2009, 25 years after her murder, that a DNA technician named Matthew Gabriel, working under Homicide Inspector Holly Pera at San Francisco's Cold Case Unit, finally generated a viable profile from the trace evidence preserved at the scene in 1984. That profile was submitted to state and federal databases. It matched Richard Ramirez. By that time, Ramirez was already convicted of 13 other murders and sitting on death row at San Quentin State Prison. He was never charged with Leung's murder. He died in 2013, still technically unconvicted for the first life he ever took. His wife Doreen Leoie, who had written him dozens of letters, visited him 4 times a week, and publicly declared she would take her own life when he was executed, severed her relationship with him the year the DNA result was announced. The confirmation that he had raped and murdered a 9-year-old girl was more than even her devotion could survive. And then in 2016, something else came to light from that basement on O'Farrell Street. A second DNA profile was found at the scene. A second person's genetic material, entirely distinct from Ramirez's, present at the murder of Leung on April 10, 1984. Investigators believe this second person was a juvenile at the time of the killing. They have never been publicly identified. No charges have ever been brought. Their name remains unknown to this day. Somewhere in the world, there is a person who was in that basement. And we still do not know who they are. After Leung's murder, Richard Ramirez went quiet. For 9 months, from April 1984 through autumn, through winter, through the early months of 1985, there were no confirmed killings linked to him. He continued his burglaries through Los Angeles. He continued using cocaine. He continued his invisible existence in cheap downtown rooms, moving between neighborhoods, slipping in and out of the city the way smoke passes under a closed door. What was moving through his mind during those 9 months, no one can say with certainty. What the pattern of his crimes would reveal is that this was not a man who had tried violence and pulled back. This was a man who had crossed one line, understood something about himself on the other side of it, and was now circling the edge of everything that would follow. Those 9 months were not a retreat. They were a slow, deliberate approach. And all the while, Los Angeles was dressed up for the world, hosting the 1984 Summer Olympics, the Lakers in the middle of their Showtime era, the city performing its best version of itself for an international audience. None of it had anything to do with the man in the black clothes in the cheap room in downtown Los Angeles, lying awake in the dark, playing Night Prowler on repeat. Glassell Park is a quiet neighborhood in the northeast of Los Angeles. In 1984, it was a working-class area. Apartment buildings from the 1950s and 1960s, small yards, streets lined with old trees, the kind of neighborhood where people left their windows open in summer because the nights were warm and because nothing like this had ever happened here before. Jenny Vincow was 79 years old, a widow. She lived alone in a first-floor apartment in a building in Glassell Park, where her son Jack also had a unit. She was an independent woman, living fully on her own terms, which is exactly where she had every right to be, on the night of June 27th going into the early hours of June 28, 1984. Ramirez found her apartment. He found the mesh screen on one of her windows and removed it, quietly, with the same patience and silence he had been practicing his entire life. He climbed in through the open window. He moved through the darkened apartment to the bedroom where Jenny Vincao was sleeping. She was stabbed 7 times in the head, the neck, the chest. The coroner determined that 4 of the 7 wounds were individually lethal. Her throat was slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated, with 1 wound severing the jugular vein. The apartment was ransacked, drawers opened, valuables taken. Her clothing had been disturbed, though the coroner found no confirmed forensic evidence of sexual assault. Jack Vincao arrived at his mother's apartment the following afternoon, between 1 and 2 o'clock on June 28, 1984. He noticed the front door unlocked. He noticed her belongings scattered across the floor. He found Jenny Vincao in her bedroom. He ran to the building manager and called the police. When investigators processed the scene, they found something on the window screen, which had been placed just inside the apartment. A fingerprint. 4 prints were lifted in total, 2 clear enough to potentially identify. They were filed. They were compared against available records. And they found nothing because in 1984, the automated fingerprint identification system that would one day crack this case wide open did not yet exist. Those 2 prints sat in a filing cabinet, waiting for technology that had not been invented yet. Meanwhile, Richard Ramirez stepped back through the window and into the night. In the months following Jenny Vincao's murder, something shifted in the neighborhoods of Los Angeles that people could feel but not name. Break-ins where very little was taken but where evidence suggested someone had moved slowly through a home, had lingered in bedrooms where people were sleeping. Reports from neighbors of figures in dark clothing seen near houses in the early hours. A particular unease in certain streets that had no obvious source. Ramirez drove on those nights through neighborhoods he selected from no clear pattern. Not wealth, not geography, not the age or race of the people inside. He moved through the city the way a current moves through water, present everywhere, visible nowhere, reading each house for the one thing he was always reading it for. A window not quite closed, a door not quite locked, a gap between the sleeping world and himself. He ate almost nothing. He slept in fragments. He was 24 years old, and he weighed next to nothing, and his teeth were black at the edges, and when people encountered him they moved away slightly without knowing why. In his room at night he played his one record, Night Prowler, over and over, the song about moving through darkness unseen. It matched something inside him with a precision that felt almost designed. He believed Satan was watching over him, protecting him, that the fingerprint in the filing cabinet and the cold case folder with Leung's name in it were simply proof that he had been chosen, that the world systems were not built to stop what he was. For 9 months after Jenny Vincao's murder, Los Angeles slept without knowing his name. That was about to end, because in March of 1985, Richard Ramirez came back to those quiet streets. And what he did next, the names, the dates, the addresses, the families who opened their doors the next morning and found what he had left behind, is the part of this story that made California stop sleeping entirely. Before the murders that would set California on fire, Richard Ramirez had already been doing something else in the early months of 1985 that went largely unreported. Something that a young detective at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department would notice first, before anyone else was paying attention. In February 1985, children began disappearing from their neighborhoods in the San Gabriel Valley and northeast Los Angeles area. They were abducted, taken somewhere, sexually assaulted, and then abandoned, left somewhere close to where they had been taken, alive but broken. Among the named survivors was a 6-year-old girl named Anastasia Hrones, taken from the Montebello area. The descriptions these children and their families gave to police were consistent. A tall man, lean, dark clothing, a members-only style jacket, brown-stained gap teeth, an overpowering smell of sweat and decay. Detective Gil Carrillo at the LAPD Homicide Bureau had been on the case for only a few weeks when he began connecting these child abductions to something larger, something nobody else in the building was yet willing to see as a single picture. He would carry that theory with him for months before he could prove it to anyone who mattered. On the evening of March 17, 1985, Richard Ramirez drove a stolen car into the San Gabriel Valley. He had a .22 caliber handgun, a bag containing tools, and somewhere he had decided to go. He had been here before, to a condominium complex in Rosemead which he had previously burgled, and he knew the layout. He entered the garage of the complex on Highcliffe Drive and waited in the dark. 22-year-old Maria Hernandez arrived home that evening and pulled into the garage. Ramirez stepped out of the shadows and raised the gun. He fired directly at her face. The bullet struck her house keys, which she instinctively raised in front of her, and deflected. She fell to the ground. She played dead. He stepped over her and entered the house. Inside, 34-year-old Dale Yoshi Okazaki was in the kitchen. She had heard the shot from the garage and ducked behind the counter, hoping whatever was happening would not come through the door. Ramirez walked into the kitchen. She raised her head for a fraction of a second to look. He was waiting for exactly that. He shot her once in the forehead. She died instantly on the kitchen floor. He walked back through the garage, stepping over Maria Hernandez, who was still lying there, still alive, still not moving, and drove away. Within an hour, on a street less than 2 miles away in Monterey Park, he struck again. 30-year-old Salerno, known to her family as Veronica, was sitting in her car on Alhambra Avenue when Ramirez pulled her door open and dragged her out onto the road. He shot her twice with the same .22 caliber handgun. A passing police officer found her still breathing in the road. She died before the ambulance arrived. She was 30 years old. 3 attacks in a single evening. 1 survivor. 2 dead. And by the time the sun came up on March 18, 1985, the Los Angeles media had a new name for whoever was doing this. Not yet the Night Stalker. That name would come later. For now, they were calling him the walk-in killer. The Valley Intruder. Nobody knew yet that the worst was still to come. 10 days after the murders of Dale Okazaki and Salerno, Ramirez drove to Whittier, a quiet suburban city southeast of Los Angeles. He had been to the house before on a previous burglary, and he knew the layout, knew who lived there, knew the rhythms of that household. 64-year-old Vincent Charles Zazera was asleep in his bedroom when Ramirez entered through an unlocked window. He was shot once in the head with a .22. He died without waking. His wife, 44-year-old Maxine Lavinia Zazera, woke up when she heard the shot. She reached for a shotgun that she kept near the bed. She had always kept it there for exactly this kind of moment. But the gun was not loaded. She could not fire it. Ramirez shot her 3 times and then, with the knives he found in the kitchen, stabbed her repeatedly after she was already dead. He carved a T-shape into her chest. He gouged out her eyes and placed them in a jewelry box near her body. He left a shoe print in the flower bed outside the window. A clear impression from a size 11.5 Avia aerobic shoe, a brand new to the United States at the time, with only 1 pair sold in the entire Los Angeles area. That shoe print would become one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in the entire investigation. It would follow Ramirez from crime scene to crime scene for months, until the day he threw the shoes off the Golden Gate Bridge. The Zazera children found their parents 2 days later. On April 14, 1985, Ramirez entered a home in Monterey Park belonging to William Doy, 65 years old, and his wife Lily, who was physically disabled. He shot William Doy in the face with a .25 caliber handgun as he reached for his own gun. Doy managed to call the police before losing consciousness. He died in hospital 9 days later. Lily Doy survived, and her description of the attacker, particularly the severely decaying, blackened, widely spaced teeth, became one of the most specific identifying details investigators had gathered to that point. On May 29, 1985, Ramirez broke into a home in Monrovia belonging to 83-year-old Mabel Bell and her disabled sister, 80-year-old Blanche Wolfe. He found a hammer in the kitchen. He bludgeoned both women with it so severely that the handle of the hammer cracked under the force. He drew a pentagram on Mabel Bell's inner thigh using her own lipstick. He drew another pentagram on the bedroom wall. Both women were found by a neighbor 2 days later, still alive, but in comas. Mabel Bell died from her injuries. Blanche Wolfe survived. The following day, May 30, 1985, Ramirez broke into a home in Burbank belonging to 41-year-old Ruth Wilson, a single mother. He bound her with handcuffs. He locked her 12-year-old son in the closet. He raped her repeatedly over the course of the assault, then slashed her with a knife before binding her son to her and leaving them both tied together in the dark. Both survived. On June 2, 1985, 29-year-old Edward Wildgans was shot and killed in his home. His girlfriend was raped multiple times and survived. In late June 1985, Ramirez raped and abducted a 6-year-old girl from her neighborhood. He later abandoned her. She survived. On June 27, 1985, 32-year-old Patty Elaine Higgins was found in her home in Arcadia with her throat slashed. She had been murdered during the night. The cooling-off periods that had once stretched to months were now gone. He was attacking sometimes twice in a single night, sometimes every few days. The intervals between the violence were shrinking to almost nothing, and the city of Los Angeles was beginning to understand, slowly with a dawning horror, that whatever was hunting it was not slowing down. July 2, 1985. Arcadia, Los Angeles County. Ramirez drove to the home of 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon, a widowed grandmother who lived alone. He entered quietly and found her sleeping. He bludgeoned her into unconsciousness with a lamp from her bedside table, then took a 10-inch butcher knife from her own kitchen and stabbed her to death. He continued stabbing her body after she was already dead. Mary Louise Cannon was 75 years old. July 5, 1985. Sierra Madre, Los Angeles County. 16-year-old Whitney Bennett was asleep in her bedroom when Ramirez entered the house. He beat her with a tire iron with a force that left her skull fractured in multiple places. She required 478 stitches to her scalp. When he could not find a suitable knife in the kitchen to finish what he had started, he returned and tried to strangle her with a telephone cord. He later told investigators that he saw electrical sparks coming from the cord as he pulled it tight around her neck, and when Whitney Bennett suddenly drew a breath, he fled the house. He believed Jesus Christ had intervened to save her. Whitney Bennett survived. July 7, 1985. Monterey Park, Los Angeles County. 2 attacks in the same neighborhood on the same night. 61-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson was beaten to death in her home. The Avia shoe print was found on her face. The same shoe print found at 7 previous crime scenes. That same night, 63-year-old Sophie Dickman was held at gunpoint in her home in the same area, bound, and sexually assaulted. She survived. July 20, 1985. Glendale, Los Angeles County. 66-year-old Maxon Needing and his 66-year-old wife Lela Needing were both shot dead in their beds. Ramirez had purchased a machete that morning. He used it on their bodies after the shootings, mutilating both of them. He fenced the stolen items from their home within hours. That same night, July 20, 1985, the same night as the Needing murders, Ramirez drove to Sun Valley and broke into the home of the Covenanth family. 32-year-old Chainarong Covenanth was shot dead in his sleep. His 32-year-old wife Somkid was beaten repeatedly, bound, and raped. Their 8-year-old son was tied up and brought into the room while Ramirez dragged Somkid through the house, demanding the location of cash and valuables. He forced her to swear on Satan that she had given him everything. He stole what he could find and left. Somkid Covenanth and her son survived. Ballistics confirmed what detectives had already begun to believe. The same .22 caliber handgun used on the Needings had been used on the Covenants. The same gun used in Dale Okazaki's murder in March. 1 gun. 1 man. Months of killing across 2 counties. 5 people murdered on a single day in July 1985. 2 different neighborhoods. 2 separate crime scenes. 1 killer moving through the city at night as if the city belonged entirely to him. On August 5, 1985, Ramirez broke into a home in Northridge belonging to 30-year-old Chris Peterson and his 27-year-old wife Virginia. He shot them both in the head. Both bullets missed vital structures. Both Chris and Virginia Peterson survived. They were later told by surgeons that the angle of entry in both cases had been millimeters from fatal. On August 9, 1985, in Diamond Bar, 35-year-old Elias Abawath was shot and killed in his sleep. His 27-year-old wife Sakina was bound, beaten, and raped. Their 3-year-old son walked into the room during the assault. Ramirez tied the child up beside his mother and continued. Sakina Abawath waited until he left, untied her child, and sent him to a neighbor's house for help. Both Sakina and her son survived. By this point, Los Angeles County law enforcement knew they were running out of time. The cooling-off periods were gone. The attacks were happening every few days. Gun sales across Los Angeles County had more than doubled. Hardware stores had run out of deadbolts and window bars. People who had never owned a weapon in their lives were sleeping with loaded guns beside their beds. And then Ramirez left Los Angeles. Whether he sensed the net closing or whether it was simply impulse, he drove north along the California coast to San Francisco, a city that had no idea what was coming. On August 18, 1985, he broke into a home in the Lake Merced neighborhood of San Francisco belonging to 66-year-old Peter Pan and his 62-year-old wife Barbara. He shot Peter Pan in the head while he slept. Peter Pan died immediately. He beat and raped Barbara Pan, who survived. In the kitchen after the assault, he helped himself to food, vomited it up, and then returned to the bedroom and wrote the words "Jack the Knife" on the wall alongside a satanic pentagram. He ejaculated beneath the writing and left. San Francisco homicide inspector Frank Falzon arrived at the Pan crime scene and later described it as the ugliest case he had ever worked in his career. The obvious shoe print at the scene told him that the Night Stalker from Los Angeles had arrived in his city. On August 24, 1985, Ramirez attempted to break into the home of a family named Romero in Mission Viejo, in Orange County, south of Los Angeles. He was spotted outside by 13-year-old James Romero III, who watched from his window as Ramirez examined the outside of the house. The teenager noted the make, model, and partial license plate of the orange Toyota station wagon Ramirez was driving and alerted his father, who called police. Ramirez drove away from the Romero house and found another target nearby, the home of 30-year-old Bill Carnes and his 29-year-old fiancée Inez Erickson. He shot Bill Carnes 3 times in the head. Surgeons would later remove 2 of the 3 bullets. Bill Carnes survived. He beat Inez Erickson, bound her with neckties from the closet, and raped her. Before leaving, he made her say that she loved Satan. He told her, "Tell them the Night Stalker was here." He took her jewelry, walked out of the house, and drove away in his orange Toyota station wagon. Inez Erickson untied herself, went to a neighbor's house, and gave police a description of the car and a partial license plate number. It was August 24, 1985, and it was the last night Richard Ramirez would ever spend as a free man. While Richard Ramirez was moving through the neighborhoods of Los Angeles, 2 men at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department were trying to do something that nobody else in California law enforcement had yet managed to do. See the full picture. Detective Gil Carrillo was 31 years old in 1985. He had been with the LAPD Homicide Bureau for just over 4 years, young enough that some of his colleagues still considered him a rookie, despite his record. He was the detective who had first noticed, in the early months of 1985, that the child abductions in Monterey Park and Montebello and the home invasion murders scattered across the San Gabriel Valley were not separate stories. They were chapters in the same story. One man, moving through Los Angeles in the dark, leaving a pattern that was only invisible if you looked at each piece in isolation. He brought this theory to Detective Frank Salerno, a veteran LAPD homicide investigator who had previously been the lead detective in the Hillside Strangler case, the investigation that caught cousins Angelo Buono Jr. and Kenneth Bianchi. Salerno was methodical, experienced, and initially skeptical. He had never seen a single criminal with this kind of variability. Victims ranging from 6 years old to 83, methods switching between guns and knives and blunt objects, locations spread across hundreds of square miles with no geographic logic. But Carrillo kept pressing. And when Salerno looked at what the younger detective had assembled, the bullet casings, the shoe prints, the survivor descriptions of those rotting gap teeth and wide dark eyes, the satanic symbols left at certain scenes, he agreed. One man, Salerno and Carrillo began working the case together as a formal partnership in the spring of 1985. The obvious shoe print found in the flower bed outside the Zazera home in March 1985 was a crucial piece of evidence. It was a men's size 11.5, from a brand that had only recently arrived in the United States. When detectives contacted the manufacturer and traced the distribution, they found that only 1 pair of Avia aerobic shoes in that size had been sold in the entire Los Angeles area. The store owner provided a description of the customer who had bought them. As the months went by, The same shoe print appeared again and again. At the Bell and Wolf home in Monrovia. At the Joyce Lucille Nelson scene in Monterey Park. Pressed into the soil outside the window and, in one particularly haunting detail, imprinted on the face of the victim herself. At the Pan home in San Francisco. The shoe connected at least 9 crime scenes across 2 cities. Detectives Carrillo and Salerno made the decision to keep the shoe print secret from the public. It was their best physical link between crimes. As long as Ramirez did not know they were tracking it, it remained a connection he could not sever. And then San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein held a press conference. On August 30, 1985, with reporters gathered and cameras rolling, Mayor Feinstein announced publicly that police were tracking the Night Stalker through his choice of weapon, and through a very specific type of shoe print found at the crime scenes. She named the shoe brand. She gave enough detail that anyone following the case closely would understand exactly what she had disclosed. Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno heard about the press conference and were, by all accounts, incandescent with fury. They had spent months protecting that clue. It was gone in 60 seconds. Ramirez, who had been monitoring media coverage of his own crimes closely throughout the summer, heard about the press conference within hours. Shortly after, he walked to the middle of the Golden Gate Bridge and threw his Afees shoes into the San Francisco Bay. He later confirmed this to investigators after his arrest. The shoes were never recovered. On August 24, 1985, after the attack on Bill Carnes and Inez Erickson in Mission Viejo, the partial license plate number provided by young James Romero III and the description of the orange Toyota station wagon from Inez Erickson led police to begin searching for the vehicle. 4 days later, on August 28, 1985, the abandoned orange Toyota was found in the Rampart neighborhood of Los Angeles. The car was processed for evidence at the scene. A fingerprint technician lifted a single clear fingerprint from the rearview mirror of the vehicle. That print was submitted to California's automated fingerprint identification system, known as Afees, a computerized fingerprint matching database that had only recently become operational in the state. Before Afees, a fingerprint could only be matched by a human technician manually comparing it against individual records, a process so slow and labor-intensive that it was effectively useless for active criminal investigations. The fingerprint lifted from Jenny Vinco's window screen in June 1984 had sat in a file for over a year for exactly this reason. There was one further complication. The LAPD's Afees database, when it came online, had been programmed to contain only the records of individuals born after January 1, 1960. The reasoning was computational, the system had limited storage capacity, and a cutoff date was established to keep it manageable. Richard Ramirez had been born on February 29, 1960, just barely inside the cutoff. His juvenile arrest records and prior adult arrests for drug offenses, auto theft, and traffic violations were in the system. The fingerprint from the rearview mirror matched him in minutes. Had he been born 2 months earlier, his records would not have been in Afees. The match would not have been made. The press conference would not have happened. And the morning of August 31, 1985 might have gone very differently. Police already had his first name, Richard, from a San Francisco informant who had been interviewed by Inspector Falzon after the Pan murders, and who had identified a man named Rick as the person who sold him stolen jewelry from the Pan's home. The Afees match gave them the last name. It gave them his full record. It gave them his mugshot from a prior arrest. On August 30, 1985, that mugshot was broadcast on every major television network in California and printed on the front page of every newspaper in the state, including La Opinion, which ran it under the headline Invasor Nocturno. The name was out. The face was out. And Richard Ramirez, who had no idea any of this had happened, was on a bus back to Los Angeles from Tucson, Arizona, where he had gone to visit his brother and found him not home. Richard Ramirez had no idea. He had taken the bus to Tucson, Arizona on August 30, 1985. The same day his mugshot was being broadcast on every television screen and newspaper front page in California. He went to visit his brother, who was not home. He waited as long as he could stand to wait. Then he got back on a Greyhound bus and rode through the night back to Los Angeles. He arrived at the bus terminal in East Los Angeles in the early hours of August 31, 1985. Police were staking out the terminal. They had considered the possibility that he might try to flee California on an outbound bus and positioned officers there to intercept him. Ramirez walked straight past them. He had no idea his face was on every news broadcast in the state. He walked out of the terminal and into the East Los Angeles morning like a man with nowhere particular to be. He passed the Wyvernwood Market at 8th Street and Evergreen Avenue. He stopped and picked up a copy of the Los Angeles Herald from the rack outside. He did not pay for it. He looked at the front page. His own face looked back at him. He walked further down the street and stepped into a convenience store. A group of elderly Hispanic women near the door looked up as he entered. One of them went very still. She looked at him, then looked at the newspaper in her hands, then looked at him again. She pointed at him. She said, "El Matador, the killer." He saw La Opinion on the rack. The headline, "Invasor Nocturno." His photograph beneath it, large and unmistakable. He grabbed the paper and ran. He hit the street running and did not stop. He ran south toward the Santa Ana Freeway, 6 lanes of Los Angeles highway traffic moving at speed in the early morning. He crossed it on foot. He jumped the barrier and landed on the hood of a car on the other side. He rolled off and kept running into the Boyle Heights neighborhood, dripping sweat, breathing in ragged pulls, his bag still on his back. He spotted an unlocked Ford Mustang on the street with the keys in the ignition. He pulled the door open and got in. 57-year-old Jose Burgoyne had been watering the plants in the front yard of his home on Hubbard Street when he heard his neighbor Francis Romero calling out for help. He looked up and saw a man trying to steal her car. He dropped his garden hose and ran. He grabbed Ramirez by the collar and pulled him out of the Mustang with both hands. Ramirez told him that if he came any closer he was going to shoot him. Burgoyne looked at him. He did not see a weapon. He grabbed him again. Ramirez broke free and ran further down the street. He found another car, a vehicle belonging to Angelina de la Torre. He tried to take her keys. Her husband Manuel de la Torre, 36 years old, came out of the house carrying a steel fence post. He struck Ramirez across the back with it. Ramirez stumbled. He ran again. He begged at one front door for water. He abandoned his bag in a driveway. He ran down an alley. He jumped a fence. He kept moving, but the neighborhood was awake now, and every pair of eyes he passed recognized the face from the newspaper. At 8:15 in the morning, 54-year-old Jose Burgoyne Sr., Jamie Burgoyne's father, and his 17-year-old son Julio joined the crowd that had been building block by block behind Ramirez as he ran. Neighbor after neighbor spilling out of front doors. People who had been afraid to open their windows all summer, who had lain awake in the dark for months listening for sounds that should not be there. They caught him on a residential street in Boyle Heights. The crowd pinned him to the pavement. Manuel de la Torre struck him again with the steel bar. Someone else hit him. Someone else held him. He went down and he did not get up. By the time police officers from Hollenbeck Station arrived and pushed through the crowd, Richard Ramirez was lying in the road, beaten and bleeding, surrounded by the people of East Los Angeles. Jamie Burgoyne, one of the men who had held him down, told reporters afterward, "Once he stopped, everyone just got him. I guess he was tired." A neighbor named Eloise Cabral, who had been awake in her house just a few streets away listening to it all happen, said, "We were saying that if he got caught around here in East LA, he'd probably get his butt beat up. All the guys around here knew about him. They would just love to get their hands on him." Detectives Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno drove to Hollenbeck Police Station and personally escorted Richard Ramirez from the holding cell to a transport vehicle. Carrillo later described looking at the man they had been hunting for months. Beaten, disheveled, handcuffed, exactly as frightening in person as the descriptions had suggested, and feeling something he had not expected. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter and harder to name. The people of East Los Angeles who participated in the capture were later awarded official commendation plaques by the city of Los Angeles. The most feared serial killer in California history had been stopped not by a task force, not by SWAT, not by any apparatus of law enforcement. He had been stopped by a man who had been watering his garden. Jury selection for the trial of Richard Ramirez began on July 22, 1988. Judge Michael Tynan of the Los Angeles Superior Court presided. He estimated that he would need to interview as many as 2,000 prospective jurors to find 12 impartial individuals who could also commit to serving for what might be a 2-year trial. Carpenters were hired to physically enlarge the jury box in his courtroom. In the end, just short of 1,600 people were interviewed before a jury was seated. Lead prosecutor was Deputy District Attorney P. Philip Halpin, a veteran of more than 2 decades in the Los Angeles County DA's office, who had been named one of California's most effective prosecutors by California Lawyer magazine 4 years before this trial. His opening statement on January 30, 1989, methodically listed every charge across 2 hours of precise, measured argument. 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, 14 counts of burglary, more than 400 pieces of physical evidence, fingerprints, ballistics, shoe impressions. One of those shoe impressions, he told the jury, had been found pressed into the face of a murder victim. Halpin's summary, delivered in a tone of characteristic understatement after describing decapitation wounds and carved pentagrams. The essence of this case is burglaries and murders committed during the burglaries. Defense attorney Daniel Hernandez represented Ramirez, a choice the family had made that baffled many in the legal community. Given Hernandez's limited experience with capital cases, Hernandez and Halpin clashed so persistently and so personally throughout the proceedings that Judge Tynan told them both, on multiple occasions, to take their behavior into a boxing ring. Ramirez's conduct in court was designed, it seemed, to perform. He wore mirrored sunglasses throughout the proceedings, an affectation his biographer Philip Carrillo described as a deliberate imitation of a rock star. He smirked. He posed for the cameras outside the courthouse. His fan mail arrived in enormous quantities. Women wrote to him daily. Some visited him in jail. He had become, in ways that disturbed every investigator who had worked his case, a celebrity. On August 14, 1989, juror Phyllis Singletary failed to appear at the courthouse. The jury room was already tense. The deliberations had been difficult, the evidence horrific, and more than a year of service had created a particular kind of emotional bond between 12 people who had been forced to absorb the worst of what one human being had done to others. By midday, it emerged that Phyllis Singletary had been found shot to death in her apartment. The remaining jurors were terrified. The immediate, visceral fear in that jury room was that Ramirez had somehow reached out from his jail cell and had her killed as a warning. Defense attorney Ray Clark considered requesting a mistrial. The alternate juror who replaced Singletary was too afraid to return to her own home and had to be temporarily relocated. It was later confirmed that Singletary's live-in boyfriend, a man named James Melton, had shot her during a domestic dispute and then committed suicide with the same weapon later that day at a hotel. Richard Ramirez had nothing to do with her death. Judge Tynan, after consulting with jury foreman Felipe Rodriguez, who told the court that the jury believed they could continue, ordered deliberations to resume. Ramirez stood up in the courtroom before the jury was brought back in and shouted, "I have an objection. I think that's F up." Judge Tynan ordered the jury back in and resumed the trial. On September 20, 1989, after more than a year of testimony, more than 400 exhibits, and over 100 witnesses, the jury returned its verdict. Richard Ramirez was found guilty on all 43 counts, 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. Every single charge. Not one was dismissed. Not one was reduced. On November 7, 1989, Judge Michael Tynan sentenced Richard Ramirez to death. He read the formal judgment into the court record. "It is the judgment and sentence of this court that Richard Ramirez shall suffer the death penalty. This penalty is to be inflicted within the walls of the state prison at San Quentin, California, in the manner prescribed by law at a time to be fixed by this court." Ramirez was given the opportunity to speak. He addressed the courtroom, the spectators, the press, the families of the people he had murdered who were sitting in those rows of seats, and said, "I am beyond good and evil. I will be avenged." Prosecutor Halpin, when reporters congratulated him outside the courthouse, said only, "The right thing happened." Philip Halpin retired from the Los Angeles County DA's office in 2001 after 36 years of service. He died on his 65th birthday in a hospice in Bend, Oregon. He was described by Los Angeles District Attorney Steve Cooley as one of the finest prosecutors the state had ever produced. On November 16, 1989, Deputy Bud Phillips woke Richard Ramirez in his cell at 6 in the morning, fastened waist chains and handcuffs, and escorted him to a waiting helicopter that flew them to Long Beach, where they boarded a Cessna 210 and flew north. Ramirez, looking out the window over Hollister, asked Phillips about an earthquake that had occurred the previous month. Phillips looked down at the landscape below them and said, "You should go skydiving." Ramirez replied that he didn't have a parachute. They landed at San Quentin State Prison in Marin County. Richard Ramirez was walked onto death row. The doors closed behind him. San Quentin State Prison sits on a peninsula in Marin County, overlooking San Francisco Bay from the north. In its east block, reserved for death row inmates, Richard Ramirez was assigned a cell. He would live in that cell for over 23 years. The fan mail began arriving almost immediately. Women wrote to him. Young women, middle-aged women, women who sent photographs of themselves, who described their feelings for him in detailed letters, who visited him at the prison during visiting hours and sat across from him through the glass divider and told him things that the guards outside could not quite hear. The phenomenon was not new. Serial killers and violent criminals had attracted admirers before, but the scale of it in Ramirez's case was extraordinary. Criminologists would later describe it using the term hybristophilia, a romantic attraction to people who have committed violent crimes. The press called his admirers the Night Stalker groupies. He received more mail than almost any other inmate on California's death row. Among the women who wrote to him was Doreen Leung. She was a freelance magazine editor, intelligent and articulate, who had begun writing to Ramirez in 1985, the year of his arrest, before the trial had even begun. She wrote 75 letters over the years of his incarceration. She visited him 4 times a week. She described him in interviews as kind, caring, and funny, a man whose public image bore no relationship to the person she had come to know. In 1988, Ramirez proposed to her. She accepted. On October 3, 1996, Doreen Leung and Richard Ramirez were married in the visiting room at San Quentin State Prison. Doreen wore a white suit. Ramirez wore prison clothes. Several of his female admirers were present as witnesses. Doreen Leung told the press that she was certain of his innocence, that she believed the justice system had failed him, and that she would take her own life on the day the state of California executed him. She maintained this position publicly for years. Then, in 2009, the DNA result came back from the cold case unit at the San Francisco Police Department. Ramirez's DNA was matched to the murder of May Leung, the 9-year-old girl in the basement on O'Farrell Street in April 1984. Doreen Leung severed her relationship with Richard Ramirez immediately. She gave no interviews. She has not spoken publicly about him since. At the time of his death, Ramirez was reportedly engaged to a 23-year-old writer who lived between Los Angeles and New York. She had begun corresponding with him on death row several years earlier. In December 2024, Peacock released a 2-part documentary series called Richard Ramirez, The Night Stalker Tapes. The series was built around something that had never before been made available to the public: over 25 hours of audio recordings made by Ramirez himself while on death row at San Quentin. Recordings in which he spoke about his childhood, his crimes, his beliefs, and his understanding of what he had done. In those recordings, his voice is calm, measured, sometimes almost conversational. He describes his cousin Mike Valles with something approaching admiration. Vicious, mean, strong, determined. He discusses Satanism with the seriousness of a man describing a theology he has studied and believes in. He does not express remorse for the murders. He does not acknowledge his victims as people whose lives he ended. They are, in his recorded voice, simply part of a story whose protagonist is himself. The series also brought Rosie Juárez's story into wider public view. Her account of the abuse that began when she was between 6 and 7 years old. Her letter to him in prison. His reply. For many viewers, those recordings, his calm voice, his absence of remorse, his articulate self-justification, were more disturbing than anything the crime scene photographs had ever shown. Because the photographs showed what he did. The recordings showed who he was. Richard Ramirez spent 23 years and 7 months on death row at San Quentin State Prison. He outlasted 3 California governors. He outlasted a dozen scheduled execution dates that were postponed due to appeals, legal challenges, and the slow administrative machinery of capital punishment in a state that has the largest death row population in the United States and almost never carries out its sentences. He was, in those years, in many ways exactly where the state said he was: contained, monitored, denied freedom. But he was also alive. He was receiving mail. He was getting married. He was giving interviews. He was the subject of documentaries and books and fan websites, while the families of his victims quietly carried the weight of what he had done to them through every ordinary day of those 23 years. In his final years on death row, Ramirez was diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma, a cancer of the blood. His health deteriorated steadily. His weight dropped. In early June 2013, he was transferred by ambulance from San Quentin to Marin General Hospital in Greenbury, California, under custody and under guard. A correction officer was posted outside his hospital room around the clock. He was shackled to the hospital bed. On June 7, 2013, at 9:10 in the morning, Richard Ramirez died. He was 53 years old. He died of liver failure as a complication of the B-cell lymphoma. He died without expressing remorse for a single murder, without acknowledging a single victim by name in any final statement, without the closure that the families of his victims had been waiting for through 2.5 decades of court dates and appeals and scheduled executions that never came. The gas chamber at San Quentin never claimed him. Nature moved faster than the justice system. His body was cremated. There was no public memorial. The case of Richard Ramirez is officially closed. He was convicted. He was sentenced. He died on death row. The file has a cover and a conclusion and a date of death. But there are threads in this story that were never tied off. Questions that a conviction and a death sentence cannot answer, because the man who held the answers died without giving them. There is the matter of Leung, the 9-year-old girl in the basement on O'Farrell Street. Her murder was confirmed by DNA in 2009 and attributed to Ramirez, but he was never charged, never tried, never formally convicted for what he did to her. She exists in the legal record as an unresolved case. And then there is the second DNA profile found at her crime scene in 2016. A second person, present in that basement on April 10, 1984. Believed to have been a juvenile at the time. Never identified. Never charged. Never named publicly. Somewhere alive in the world today, carrying the knowledge of what happened in that basement. That case remains open. There is the question, raised by criminal investigators who studied the gaps in his timeline, of whether there were other murders between June 1984 and March 1985, during the 9 months of apparent silence, that simply have never been attributed to him. There is too long a gap, too established a pattern of escalation, for that silence to be entirely explained. Some believe he killed during those months in ways and places that have never been connected to his name. And there is his niece Rosie Juárez, whose memoir His Niece, published in April 2026, is the most recent chapter in this story. A woman who survived what he did to her in the dark of her own home when she was between 6 and 7 years old, who spent years being disbelieved by the people around her, who finally stood in front of a television camera and a book publisher and said, "This happened, this is what it was, and the world deserves to know." Richard Ramirez believed, genuinely and specifically, that Satan had chosen him, that he was protected, that he was beyond the reach of ordinary consequence. He believed this in the desert outside El Paso when he was 15. He believed it in the cheap rooms of downtown Los Angeles when he was 23. He believed it in the courtroom in 1989 when he told the world that he was beyond good and evil. He was wrong about most of it. He was caught by a man watering his garden. He was convicted by 12 people who had been subjected to 16 months of the worst evidence a Los Angeles jury had ever been asked to absorb. He died not in a gas chamber, as the sentence demanded, but in a hospital bed, shackled to a rail, with a guard outside the door and nobody who loved him in the room. The darkness he had always believed was his, the darkness he had moved through his entire life as if it belonged to him, was, in the end, just the dark. That is the full story of Richard Ramirez. The Night Stalker. From the boot factory in El Paso where his mother breathed chemical fumes before he was born, to the hospital bed in Marin County where he died without remorse at 9:10 in the morning on June 7, 2013. Every name you heard in this video belonged to a real person. Every date was a real day. Every address was a real home where a real family was sleeping when the door came open in the dark. The three things I want you to carry out of this video, the three facts that most people who think they know this story have never been told. First, there is a person whose DNA was found at the scene of May Leung's murder in San Francisco in 1984. They were present in that basement. They have never been identified. That case is open today. Second, the Night Stalker, the man who made California afraid to open its own windows, was not caught by law enforcement. He was caught by a 57-year-old man named Jose Burgoyne who had been standing in his front yard, watering his plants, when he heard his neighbor call for help. He grabbed Ramirez with both hands and did not let go. Third, in April 2026, just weeks ago, a woman named Rosie Juárez published the first full account of what her uncle did to her in the dark of her own home beginning when she was between 6 and 7 years old. Her book is called His Niece. It is available now. And if you want to understand who Richard Ramirez really was, not just what he did in those 15 months across California, but what he had always been behind every closed door of his life, that book is where the truth lives. If this is the first case you have watched on Truth Finder Afees, subscribe right now. Because next week we are going deeper into a case that has never been fully told in one place before. A case with an unsolved thread that connects two countries, a victim that nobody in the media has named correctly, and an investigator who spent 30 years trying to close a file that the system kept reopening. You will not want to miss it, and you will only see it if you are here. Drop a comment below and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And what was the detail in this video that you had never heard before? I am Truth Finder Afees, and this was the Night Stalker.